She stood 6 feet away from her husband and heard everything: the crystal chandeliers, the champagne, the silk gown that cost more than most people's rent. None of it mattered the moment Adrian DeLuca opened his mouth. She's useful, but she'll never be my real wife. 2 years of marriage, 700 nights of silence she mistook for strength, gone in one sentence. Vivian Ashcroft didn't scream, didn't cry. She picked up her glass, smiled at the woman beside her, and made a decision that would shake the most dangerous man in New York to his core. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The night Vivian's world cracked open, she was wearing a dress she hated. It was red, deep, arterial red, the kind Adrian always chose for her when they had to appear in public together. She had learned not to argue about the color. She had learned not to argue about most things. 2 years of marriage to Adrian DeLuca had a way of filing down a woman's sharper edges until she looked in the mirror and no longer recognized the shape of her own face. The Whitmore Hotel ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread. 12-foot floral arrangements, string quartets positioned at every corner, 200 people in black tie pretending they didn't all know where the real money in the room came from. The Manhattan Children's Relief Foundation Gala was technically a charity event, but everyone standing under those chandeliers understood that this was where power came to see and be seen, where handshakes happened that no contract would ever record. Vivian moved through it the way she always did at these things, gracefully, carefully, with a smile calibrated to exactly the right temperature, warm enough to be approachable, cool enough to signal that she was Adrian DeLuca's wife and not someone you spoke to carelessly. She was good at the performance. She had been good at it since before she understood what she was performing. She had excused herself from a conversation with the wife of a city councilman, a pleasant woman who talked too much about her golden retriever, and slipped toward the terrace corridor where the noise softened and the air tasted less like perfume and ambition. She was not looking for Adrian. She had long ago stopped tracking his movements at events like this. He would find her when he needed her. He always did. But she heard his voice before she saw him. Low, measured. The voice he used when he was doing business in a room that wasn't technically a boardroom. She stopped behind a column of white marble, half hidden by the overflow of a floral arrangement that probably cost more than her first apartment. She was not eavesdropping. She told herself that clearly, in the rational part of her mind that still functioned the way it had before she met him. She was simply pausing, catching her breath. There were other voices. 3 men, she thought. Investors, from the cadence of it. Wealthy men doing the dance of wealthy men who want to appear casual while discussing things that are anything but. The Harmon acquisition. We've been cautious about visible assets. Understood, which is why the foundation partnership works. Clean paper trail, legitimate flow, and then one of them, she recognized the voice as Dominique Ferrer, a real estate developer whose name appeared on buildings she passed every day. Said something she didn't fully catch, but she caught the tail end of it. Something about Adrian's situation, something about the arrangement being convenient. Adrian's response was immediate and quiet and utterly without hesitation. She's useful, but she'll never be my real wife. Vivian did not move. She was aware distantly that her champagne glass was still in her hand. She was aware that the string quartet had shifted into something slow and minor key. She was aware that her lungs were working. She could feel them, which was strange, because she had stopped feeling most physical things at events like this years ago. She had trained herself out of it, but she felt this. The words landed differently than she would have expected. There was no dramatic crack in her chest, no sudden rush of tears, no white-hot fury. There was only a sensation she could only describe as something settling, like sediment dropping to the bottom of a glass of water that had been shaken for a very long time. Oh, she thought, so that's what this is. She turned and walked back into the ballroom. She found the councilman's wife and listened to 15 more minutes about the golden retriever. She laughed at the right moments. She touched the woman's arm once, warmly, and said she had to circulate. She found Adrian across the room 20 minutes later, standing with a state senator and 2 men she didn't recognize, and she slid into place beside him with the precise ease of someone who had rehearsed this entrance 1,000 times. He glanced at her. just briefly, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that functioned, for Adrian, as acknowledgement. She smiled back, and inside her chest, in the place where something had just settled, she began to make a list. Adrian DeLuca had grown up in a house where silence was currency. His father, Matteo, had been the kind of man who expressed affection through the absence of violence. If he didn't hit you, it meant he was pleased with you. If he looked at you long enough to hold eye contact, that was love. By the time Adrian was 12, he understood that the world sorted itself into two categories: people who controlled the silence and people who were controlled by it. He had decided, with the cold clarity of a child who has already seen too much, that he would not be the second kind. He had spent 30 years building on that decision, and he had built something formidable. He was not a man people described warmly. Feared, yes. Respected, in the way that a loaded weapon is respected. He ran his empire with the kind of organized precision that made federal investigators curse him privately and admire him the way you admire a chess player who is always thinking 4 moves ahead. He was not impulsive, he was not sentimental, he did not make decisions with his stomach. He had made one exception, exactly once, and he had spent 2 years trying to convince himself he hadn't. He watched Vivian across the room as she said something that made the councilman's wife laugh, and he felt the thing he always felt when he watched her when she didn't know he was watching, a tightness in his chest that he had categorized years ago as a security concern and refused to re-examine. He had said what he said to Ferrer and the others because it was necessary. Because men like Ferrer needed to believe that Adrian's domestic life was a transaction, same as everything else. Because in the world Adrian operated in, a man who loved his wife was a man with a target painted on something fragile. He had said it to protect her. He believed this completely. He was also wrong in ways he did not yet have the language for. The weeks after the gala passed the way all their weeks had passed, in a kind of curated quiet that Vivian now understood was not peace but performance. She served him coffee in the morning. She attended the dinners that required her attendance. She wore the dresses he selected and answered the questions people asked about their life with the fluency of someone who has told the same story so many times it has lost all relationship to the truth. But she had begun to disappear around the edges, quietly, carefully, the way she had learned to do most things in this life. She had found the listing for the internship at Halcyon Press in Boston 3 months before the gala, through a college friend named Priya who worked in their submissions department. It had felt theoretical then, something to read about late at night when Adrian was in his office, on calls that could not be discussed, and she was sitting on the floor of their closet with a book she wasn't really reading. After the gala, it stopped being theoretical. She had emailed Priya from her personal laptop, the one Adrian had never asked about because Adrian had always assumed that Vivian's inner life was not a security risk. She had used the email address she'd maintained since graduate school, the one that predated him entirely, and she had been accepted within 10 days. She told no one. She began to pack in increments so small they were almost invisible. A book here, a photograph there. The things that were hers alone. Not the jewelry he'd bought her, not the designer pieces, not the curated evidence of their life together. The things she'd arrived with. The things that still remembered what she had been before she became Adrian DeLuca's wife. She kept the suitcase under a cedar shelf in the back of the closet, behind winter coats she never wore because Adrian preferred they winter in places that didn't require heavy coats. She was methodical about it. She had learned from 2 years of living inside his world how to be methodical. She met Celeste Laurent by accident, the way most terrible things happen, in an unremarkable location, on an ordinary afternoon, without any warning at all. It was a bookstore in the West Village, which Vivian had been visiting every few weeks since before the marriage because it was the one place in this city that still felt like hers. The kind of narrow, overstuffed shop where the owner knew your name and the cat sleeping in the poetry section was named Faulkner. She was reaching for a novel when a woman's hand reached for it at the same moment, and they both laughed, and the woman said, "Please, go ahead," in a voice that carried the trace of something European. Celeste Laurent was the kind of beautiful that didn't require effort. Tall, composed, with dark hair cut in a way that suggested she spent very little time worrying about it. She had the bearing of someone who had been certain of her own worth for so long it had become architectural, just part of her structure. They ended up sharing a recommendation with the owner, which led to a conversation, which led to coffee at the place 2 doors down, which is how Vivian found herself sitting across from a woman who, 20 minutes in, mentioned that she'd lived in New York years ago, that she'd moved back recently, that she had, and here something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, controlled so quickly Vivian almost missed it. Some unfinished business here. It was not until 2 days later, when she was searching for a restaurant name on Adrian's second phone by accident, the one he left on the kitchen counter, unlocked, something he never did, that she saw the text thread. Celeste. Back in the city. We should talk. Adrian had not responded, but he had read it. The timestamp was recent. Vivian stood in the kitchen for a long time with the phone in her hand. She thought about this woman in the bookstore, the composure, the beauty that required no effort, the phrase unfinished business, delivered with eyes that had gone carefully flat. She put the phone back exactly where she'd found it. She went to the closet and looked at the suitcase. She thought, sooner. Adrian noticed the silence had changed texture, and it bothered him in ways he couldn't quantify, which bothered him more. He had always been able to read a room. It was fundamental to his survival, the ability to walk into any space and take the temperature of it within seconds. He read intentions, micro-expressions, the specific quality of stillness that meant danger versus the specific quality that meant submission. He had built a career on this. But Vivian had always been the one person whose silences he could not fully decode, and he had chosen, repeatedly, to interpret that opacity as safety. If he didn't understand it, he couldn't be moved by it. If he couldn't be moved by it, she couldn't be used against him. He told himself this was strategic. Standing in the hallway outside their bedroom at 2 a.m, listening to the specific quality of quiet coming from behind a closed door, he had the unwelcome thought that maybe it had never been strategy at all. Maybe it had been cowardice wearing strategy's clothing. He did not open the door. He went back to his office and worked until dawn, which was what he always did with thoughts that made him uncomfortable. He found the suitcase on a Thursday morning. He was not looking for it. He was looking for a cufflink that had fallen behind the winter coats. A small, stupid domestic errand. And he pushed aside 2 heavy coats and found a suitcase he had never seen before, half-packed, with the deliberate precision of someone who had been doing this slowly and carefully over a long period of time. He stood there for a moment. He recognized the books, the small framed photograph of her mother, the journal with the green cover she'd been carrying since before they met, the things that didn't belong to their life together, the things that belonged only to her. He closed the closet door. He went to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water. He stood at the window and looked at the city, 43 floors down, the morning moving through its paces with complete indifference to the fact that his wife was packing a bag to leave him. He stayed very still, and then he went to find her. She was in the living room with a book she wasn't reading. She heard him come in, heard the specific weight of his footsteps, and she looked up and saw it immediately. The controlled stillness that meant he was working very hard to keep his face neutral. She had spent 2 years learning his tells. She knew every one of them. "You want to explain something to me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. "The suitcase, Vivian." She set the book down. She looked at him, really looked, without the diplomatic buffer she usually kept between herself and the full reality of him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, and he looked for the first time in as long as she could remember, uncertain. The feared crime boss of New York looked uncertain, and part of her felt something about that. But the part of her that had been standing behind a marble column 3 weeks ago had already made its decision. "I heard you," she said, "at the gala." Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for. "What did you hear?" "Everything." She kept her voice level. She was proud of that. "I heard what you told Ferrer. I heard exactly what I am to you." He didn't say anything. She watched him try to and fail, and she understood in that moment that this was genuinely new territory for him. Adrian DeLuca, who had a response for everything, who could negotiate his way out of a federal wire with 14 seconds of careful language, had no idea what to say to his wife right now. "So," she stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected. "I have one question, and I need you to actually answer it." He waited. "Why did you marry me?" The silence that followed was the longest silence she had ever stood inside. It stretched, and she watched him reach for something, saw the machinery of him working, saw him hunting for the calculation that would navigate this, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that he was going to let it run. The machine was going to keep running because he didn't know how to turn it off. She picked up her bag from beside the couch. She had put it there that morning because she had known, somehow, that it was going to be today. "Okay," she said quietly, and she walked past him toward the door. "Vivian." She didn't stop. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. She pressed L. He was still standing in the hallway when the doors closed between them, and she had the strange, terrible, clarifying thought that this might be the most honest thing that had ever happened between them. Not a single word spoken, just the truth of who they each were, finally visible without the performance to cover it. The elevator descended. 43 floors. She stared at her own reflection in the polished metal doors and noticed that she looked like herself. Really, genuinely herself. Not Adrian DeLuca's wife, not the woman in the red dress, not the carefully maintained performance, just Vivian. The lobby appeared. She walked through it without stopping. Outside, Manhattan opened up around her, indifferent and enormous, and full of the noise of a city that kept moving no matter what collapsed inside its buildings. And she did not look back at the tower behind her even once. She had a flight to book. She had a life to locate. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing on that sidewalk with the October wind cutting through the red dress she would later throw away, was that in the apartment above her, Adrian DeLuca was doing something he had not done since he was 12 years old. He was standing completely still with no plan. And somewhere in the city, a woman named Celeste Laurent was reading a message that had just arrived on her phone and beginning to smile. The flight to Boston was at 7:15 in the morning. Vivian knew this because she had looked it up 11 times over the past 3 weeks. Not booking it, just looking. The way you press your tongue against a sore tooth to confirm it still hurts. She had the departure time memorized the way she had memorized Adrian's schedule, his tells, the specific temperature of his silences. Years of paying close attention to things that might save her had left her with a mind that cataloged everything whether she wanted it to or not. She walked 12 blocks before she realized she had no destination. The October air hit the back of her neck and her ears and the exposed stretch of collarbone above the red dress, and it occurred to her that she had walked out of a 43-story building with her bag and no coat, because the coat she'd reached for this morning was the one hanging in front of the suitcase, and she hadn't wanted to touch the suitcase yet. Not until it was time. It was time now. She just wasn't ready for that either. She stopped at a corner on 58th Street and stood with taxis and delivery trucks and the ordinary chaos of a Thursday morning moving around her, and she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way the therapist she'd seen for 8 months before meeting Adrian had taught her, back when she was a 26-year-old graduate student who cried in parking garages and thought that was normal. Her phone was in her bag. She hadn't looked at it since she left. She made herself look at it now. 14 missed calls would have been dramatic. There were 0. There was one text sent 4 minutes after she'd stepped into the elevator, and it said only, Vivian. Not a question, not a sentence, just her name, typed and sent, which was somehow worse than anything he could have written out in full because it meant he hadn't known what to say next and had sent it anyway. She stared at that single word for longer than she intended. Then she hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of Priya's apartment in Greenpoint, because Priya was the only person in this city who had known her before any of this began. And right now that felt like the only solid ground she could locate. Priya Mehta opened the door in paint-stained sweatpants at 8:15 in the morning, took one look at Vivian standing in the hallway in a floor-length red gown, and said, "I'll make coffee." That was one of the things Vivian loved most about Priya. She did not require explanation before providing comfort. She was an editor by profession and a pragmatist by temperament, and she had watched Vivian navigate the DeLuca marriage from a careful distance for 2 years, saying very little, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that some stories had to arrive at their own conclusions. Vivian sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around a mug that said Boston Marathon 2019 on it, and the irony of that was not lost on her. "He found the suitcase," she said. Priya sat down across from her. "What happened?" "I left." Before or after the conversation? There wasn't really a conversation. Priya was quiet for a moment. She had the quality, rare in anyone and almost extinct in Manhattan, of knowing when not to fill silence with noise. Did you tell him what you heard? I told him I heard it. Vivian looked at the coffee. He didn't deny it. What did he say? Nothing. She set the mug down. That was the answer. Priya exhaled slowly. She looked at her hands on the table, then back at Vivian, with the expression of a woman carefully choosing what to say next from among several things she could say. Viv, what do you need right now? Tonight? I need you to not ask me if I'm sure about Boston. I wasn't going to. Everyone always asks if I'm sure. I know? Priya reached across the table and covered Vivian's hand with hers for just a moment. Not lingeringly, not dramatically, just the brief, warm weight of it. You can have the couch. Or the bed. I'll take the couch. I don't care. Vivian nodded. She was very tired. She hadn't understood how tired she was until she sat down somewhere that didn't require her to perform anything. Adrian did not sleep. This was not unusual. Adrian had been a poor sleeper for most of his adult life, and he had long ago arranged his nights to accommodate this. Work that could be done quietly, calls to contacts in time zones 10 hours ahead, the particular silence of a high-rise apartment in the early hours when the city below looked almost peaceful from the right altitude. But this was a different kind of not sleeping. He sat in the chair by the window in the living room, not his office, which surprised him, because his office was where he went when he needed to think. And he looked at the city, and he did not think about strategy or leverage or the 14 separate things he was managing simultaneously across 4 boroughs and 2 offshore accounts. He thought about the way Vivian had looked at him when she said, I heard you, the specific quality of her voice, level, controlled, the voice of someone who has already passed through the worst of something and come out the other side of it. He recognized that voice because he had spent 30 years cultivating that same quality in himself, and it had never once sounded as devastating as it had coming from her. He had not called her. He had sent her name and then sat with his phone in his hand like a man holding something he didn't know how to use, which was a new experience for him and one he found deeply unpleasant. By 2 a.m, Marcus Reyes was sitting across from him. Marcus was the closest thing Adrian had to a friend, which meant he was a man who had seen enough of Adrian's actual life that the pretense of formality had become unnecessary between them. He ran the legitimate side of 3 of Adrian's holdings and had the moral flexibility of someone who had made peace years ago with the fact that certain money had certain origins. You want to tell me what happened? Marcus said. It also wasn't a question. She left. Marcus took that in. He poured himself 2 fingers of the scotch Adrian had placed on the table and didn't pour any for Adrian because he knew Adrian didn't drink when something was actually wrong. For good? I don't know. Do you want her to come back? Adrian looked at him. That's not a simple question, Marcus said. So don't give me a simple answer, because the last time I asked you something like this, you told me it was complicated and then didn't speak to me for 6 days. It is complicated. Adrian, Marcus set the glass down. She's your wife, not a holding, not an asset. Is that actually complicated? Adrian was quiet for long enough that the city below shifted through one full cycle of traffic signals. She heard me, he finally said. At the Whitmore. Marcus's expression went somewhere flat and careful. What exactly did she hear? Adrian told him, precisely. The words, the context, the way Ferrer had asked, and the calculation Adrian had made in less than a second, the same calculation he made about everything, the one that ran on its own now, autonomically, like breathing. Say what keeps her safe. Say what makes her less of a target. Say what protects her. When he finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You know how that sounds, Marcus said. I know how it sounds. You know that what you told yourself it was and what she heard are not the same thing. I know that too. So what are you going to do about it? Adrian looked at the window, the city, his own reflection in the glass, which looked older than he was prepared for. I don't know, he said, and he hated how true that was. Marcus picked up his glass. In my experience, he said carefully, which is admittedly not with women like Vivian, a man who doesn't know what he wants to do usually already knows and just doesn't want to do it. Adrian didn't answer. Marcus finished his drink and left at 3, and Adrian stayed in the chair until the sky outside began its slow gray change toward morning and he thought about a suitcase packed with books and a green journal and a photograph of a woman's mother, assembled in secret over weeks or months, with a care and patience that he recognized because it was the same kind of care and patience he brought to the things that mattered most to him. That thought was harder to sit with than he expected. Celeste Laurent had a hotel suite on the 32nd floor of the Meridian, which told you certain things about her financial situation and certain other things about her preference for altitude and anonymity. She was not hiding. She was simply not announcing herself, which was different and a distinction she had always understood intuitively. She had been back in New York for 3 weeks. She had sent Adrian one message. He had not replied, which was not surprising. Adrian DeLuca's silences were their own form of communication, and she had spent 2 years learning to read them before she understood that some silences were genuinely walls and not doors with stuck hinges. What she had not anticipated was the woman in the bookstore. She had recognized Vivian DeLuca from photographs, the kind of photographs that appeared in the background of society pages and charity event coverage, always slightly to the left of center, always composed and beautiful, and somehow just slightly out of focus, as if the camera itself wasn't sure how to capture her. Celeste had looked at those photographs over the years with a careful neutrality she was proud of and had never quite achieved. The woman in the bookstore had been sharper than the photographs, more present. There was something in her eyes that Celeste hadn't expected. Not softness and not hardness, but something that lived between those. Something that looked like a person who had been paying very close attention for a long time. She had liked her, which was inconvenient. She sat now in the suite with a glass of water and her phone and a folder of documents that represented the actual reason she had come back to New York, which had nothing to do with Adrian and everything to do with the 3 years she had spent building something that certain people in the city had tried very hard to take from her. Her phone buzzed. A contact she'd been waiting on. She answered it and listened for 2 minutes, and when she hung up, she sat quietly for a moment with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating. The information she had just received changed the shape of several things. One of them involved Adrian DeLuca. Another involved a man named Dominic Ferrer. And a third, the one she sat with longest, turning over in her mind with something she refused to call guilt, involved Vivian. She picked up her phone again and pulled up a number she had not used in a long time. She put the phone back down. She picked it up again. Vivian spent 2 days at Priya's apartment and then moved to a hotel in Midtown because staying with Priya felt like borrowing someone else's life, and she was trying to stop doing that. She had spent 2 years in a borrowed life, and it had taken this long for her to understand the full cost of it. She booked the hotel on her own credit card, the one she'd maintained in her own name, a quiet act of self-preservation she'd started a year into the marriage without entirely understanding why. She ordered room service and sat cross-legged on the hotel bed, with her laptop and the Halcyon Press internship offer letter, reading it for the 14th time, as if new information might have appeared in the margins. The position started in 6 weeks. Benefits, a small stipend, a desk in an actual publishing house where people cared about books and not about what your last name could access. She would need to find an apartment in Boston. She had money, not DeLuca money, not the accounts tied to him, but the savings from her years before the marriage and the freelance work she'd done quietly during it. Enough to start. She had been staring at the offer letter for 20 minutes when someone knocked on her hotel door. She went still. The knock was not Adrian's knock. Adrian's knock, in the rare instances when he knocked, rather than simply entering spaces he owned, was 3 precise raps. This was softer, uncertain. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. Celeste Laurent was standing in the hallway of her hotel. Vivian did not open the door for a long moment. She stood with her hand on the latch and her forehead almost touching the door, and she thought, with the exhausted clarity of someone who has been awake too long, that the universe had a genuinely cruel sense of timing. She opened the door. Celeste was in a gray coat, no luggage, hands at her sides. She looked not like Vivian had expected. The composure was still there, but something had been subtracted from it. Something that looked, in a woman like this, a great deal like uncertainty. "I know how this looks," Celeste said. "Do you?" "I know who you are. I knew at the bookstore. I should have said so." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "How did you find this hotel?" I know people. That's not important. I'm here because—" She stopped, started again. "There are things you don't know. about why I came back to New York, about what's happening around Adrian right now, and I think you're in a position that's more dangerous than you realize." Vivian felt something shift in her chest. Not fear exactly, something more like the sensation of a floor proving less solid than you'd assumed. "What does that mean? Can I come in?" Vivian looked at her for another long moment. She thought about the phone she'd found on Adrian's kitchen counter, unlocked, the text thread, back in the city. She thought about the way Celeste's eyes had gone carefully flat in the bookstore when she'd mentioned unfinished business. She stepped back from the door. What Celeste told her took 40 minutes and 2 glasses of water from the minibar, and a silence at the end that lasted long enough that the heating system in the hotel room clicked on and off twice. Celeste had not come back to New York for Adrian. She had come back because she had spent 2 years building a case, carefully, quietly, with the methodical anger of a woman who had been wronged in a very specific way by a very specific man, against Dominic Ferrer. Not Adrian. Ferrer, who had, 5 years ago, used his connections to Adrian's network to force Celeste out of a business partnership she had built over a decade, leveraging documents she had signed in good faith and contacts she had trusted, and ultimately a relationship with Adrian that she had been foolish enough to believe was something other than what it was. She was here because Ferrer's organization was about to intersect with Adrian's in a way that would, if Celeste's information was correct, put anyone connected to Adrian DeLuca into the middle of something federal and irreversible. And Vivian was connected to Adrian DeLuca in the most legally visible way possible. "You're saying I'm a target," Vivian said. Her voice was very level. She noted this about herself distantly, the way you note the color of a wall in a room where something terrible is happening. "I'm saying you could become one. If you're still legally married to him when this breaks, and it will break, my source inside Ferrer's office is very clear on the timeline, you will be questioned, at minimum, at maximum." Celeste paused. "You need a lawyer before you leave for wherever you're going." "How do you know I'm leaving?" Celeste held her gaze. "Because you were in a bookstore alone on a Tuesday afternoon buying a novel about starting over, and you looked at me like someone who recognized something in a stranger they hadn't expected to find. I know that look." Vivian looked at her hands. She thought about the suitcase, the green journal, the flight she hadn't booked yet. "What was he to you?" she said finally. Not accusing. She genuinely needed to know the shape of it. Celeste was quiet for a moment. "A mistake I made with my whole self," she said, which was, Vivian thought, the most honest answer anyone had given her in a very long time. "Did he love you?" "I think," Celeste said slowly, "that Adrian DeLuca loves the way a man loves who doesn't believe he's allowed to, which means it comes out sideways. It comes out as control and distance and silence. And the person on the receiving end spends all their time trying to decode it into something warmer." She paused. "I spent 2 years doing that. And then I stopped." The words landed somewhere specific inside Vivian's chest. "I'm not here to warn you away from him," Celeste said. "I'm here because you are potentially in legal jeopardy, and you deserve to know that. What you do with your marriage is—" She spread her hands slightly. "Not mine." Vivian stood up. She walked to the window. Manhattan at noon, indifferent as always, going about the business of being enormous. She had come to this hotel to think. She had 3 decisions in front of her: Boston, the lawyer, the divorce, and she had been treating them as sequential. First this, then that. The order had seemed manageable. She understood now that the order had just collapsed. Her phone buzzed on the bed. She turned and looked at it. Adrian. Not a text this time. A call. She watched it ring. Celeste watched her watch it. It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. 3 seconds later, it began again. Vivian picked it up. She looked at his name on the screen with the particular clarity of a woman standing at the exact moment before everything that comes next. And she felt the weight of 2 years and 1 sentence overheard behind a marble column and a half-packed suitcase, and a woman sitting on her hotel bed who had made the same mistake years before she had. And she thought about what Celeste had said. It comes out sideways. And she thought about a man standing in a hallway with his hands loose at his sides and nothing in his face but an uncertainty she had never seen there before. She thought, if I answer this, nothing that follows will be simple. She thought, it was never simple. She answered it. Vivian. His voice was not the voice he used for business. It was lower than that, stripped of the architecture he usually built around it. "Where are you?" "That's not... Adrian, I need you to come home." "I can't." "I'm not asking you to forgive anything." He stopped. She could hear him breathing, which was not something she had ever noticed before, or maybe she had and had categorized it as irrelevant. "I just need to see you. I need to... There are things..." He stopped again. The machine, for once, was not running smoothly. "I don't know how to do this." Vivian's hand was tight on the phone. Across the room, Celeste was looking at the window, giving her as much privacy as a hotel room allowed. "You don't know how to do what?" Vivian said. "This," he said, and in the silence that followed that single word, she heard everything he meant by it and everything he couldn't say, and the specific weight of a man who had spent 30 years controlling every room he entered, now unable to locate the right door in the simplest conversation of his life. She closed her eyes. "There's something you need to know," she said, "before any of this, before the conversation you want to have. There's someone here who has information about Ferrer, about what's coming. And Adrian..." She paused, feeling the words arrange themselves into a shape she hadn't planned. "I think we are completely out of time." The silence on the line was absolute. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not back to the controlled precision of the man she had performed dinner parties beside for 2 years. Something different. Something that sounded, underneath its new urgency, almost like fear. "Don't move," he said. "Don't go anywhere. I'm coming to you." "Adrian? Vivian, please." She had never heard him say please before in her life, not once, not in 2 years. She looked at the phone. She looked at Celeste, who had turned from the window and was watching her with an expression that was not pity and not satisfaction, but something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman who had stood in a version of this exact moment herself, and knew precisely how many different ways it could go from here. The floor had proven less solid than either of them had assumed. And somewhere across the city, in an office Vivian had never been invited to enter, Dominic Ferrer was sitting across from 2 men in suits that did not belong to any organization Adrian DeLuca had ever done business with, and he was beginning to smile, and the thing he was smiling about had Vivian's name in it. He arrived in 19 minutes. Vivian knew because she had been watching the clock on the hotel nightstand with the focused attention of someone who needed something concrete to look at, while the rest of her mind ran through scenarios she wasn't ready to name. Celeste had moved to the chair by the window and was sitting with her legs crossed and her hands folded in her lap, composed in the way of someone who has already passed through their own version of this and is now simply present for someone else's. The knock was 3 precise raps. Vivian opened the door. Adrian DeLuca, in a hotel hallway at noon, looked like a man who had driven too fast and hadn't slept, and was working extremely hard to appear as though neither of those things was true. He was in a dark jacket, no tie, which for Adrian was essentially dishevelment. His eyes went immediately to Vivian's face, then past her shoulder to Celeste, and something moved through his expression that he locked down in under a second. But Vivian saw it because she had spent 2 years learning to see the things he locked down in under a second. "Celeste," he said. Not a greeting, a fact being acknowledged. Celeste looked at him. "Adrian." He looked back at Vivian. "You want to tell me how this happened?" "She came to me," Vivian said. "Come inside." He came inside. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the hotel room with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Celeste with an expression that was not anger and not warmth, but something that occupied the precise space between them, carefully maintained. "What did you tell her?" "What she needed to know," Celeste said. "Which was Ferrer." Celeste held his gaze without difficulty, and Vivian noted this. The specific quality of a woman who had already survived Adrian DeLuca's silences and was no longer impressed by them. "He's been in contact with a federal task force for 6 weeks. He's offering names, documentation, and 2 years of financial records in exchange for immunity. Your name is at the top of the list he's building. And..." She paused, 1 beat. "Vivian's name is on page 3. The room was very quiet. Adrian's hands came out of his pockets. He looked at Vivian. She watched him process it, really process it, not perform processing. And she saw the moment it landed. The precise moment the feared crime boss of New York understood that the woman he had spent 2 years protecting with distance and calculated coldness was now endangered by that exact distance. Because on paper she looked like a cooperative spouse, and not like someone who had been deliberately kept outside the walls. "How solid is your source?" he said to Celeste, still looking at Vivian. "Solid enough that I bought a plane ticket back from Paris." "I need a name." "You don't get a name. You get the information and you do what you do with it." Adrian looked at her now. "This isn't a negotiation." "No," Celeste said, and her voice was flat and final as a door closing. "It isn't. Because the last time I sat across from you and treated something like a negotiation, I lost 10 years of my life's work, and you didn't lose a single night of sleep. So you get the information. What you do next is your problem." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. Vivian could feel it on her skin. Adrian turned back to Vivian. When he spoke, his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard before, not the business register, not the performance register, something rawer and more fundamental than either. "I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "Not here. Come home with me." "Adrian, not for us, not for the marriage. I'll table all of that, I swear to you. I will table every bit of it for as long as you need. But if Ferrer is building a case and your name is in it, you need to be somewhere I can protect you, and I cannot do that if you're in a midtown hotel room." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the flight to Boston, the Halcyon Press offer letter on her laptop, the apartment she hadn't found yet in a city that didn't know her name. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about the way he'd said please on the phone, and she thought about what Celeste had said. It comes out sideways. And she made a decision she wasn't sure was right, which she was increasingly understanding was the only kind of decision available to her now. "Okay," she said, "but I'm not going back to the penthouse." He nodded once, immediately, without negotiation. "I have another place. Marcus knows it. It's clean." Celeste stood up from the chair. "I'll be in the city for 2 more weeks," she said. She was looking at Vivian. "You can reach me at the Meridian." She picked up her coat from the bed. She moved toward the door, and then she stopped. And she turned, and she said to Adrian, just to him, looking at him squarely, "She's better than either of us deserve to be involved in this. Remember that." She left. Adrian stood in the hotel room and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I know." The safe house was a brownstone in Carroll Gardens that smelled like old wood and someone else's coffee. Marcus had set it up 3 years ago as a contingency for a situation that had never materialized until now, which meant it was clean and stocked and completely untied to Adrian's name in any legal document. Vivian sat at the kitchen table while Adrian made calls in the back room. She could hear his voice through the wall. Low and clipped and controlled, the business register fully restored now that there was a problem he knew how to approach. She wrapped her hands around a mug of the coffee she'd made herself and looked at the kitchen of a house that belonged to no one and thought about the specific absurdity of her life. She had been planning to disappear quietly, to find herself slowly in a city that didn't know what name she was supposed to answer to. She had imagined it as a gentle kind of unraveling, mornings with manuscripts and evenings with unfamiliar streets, and the long, patient work of locating who she was when she wasn't performing something for someone else. Instead, she was sitting in a safe house in Carroll Gardens while her estranged husband made calls to people she would never be able to testify about without committing perjury. She almost laughed. She didn't, because she was too tired and because the laugh that was forming in her chest felt like it might have too many other things inside it to be safe. Adrian came back into the kitchen. He stood at the counter and looked at her. He did not sit, which she had noticed was a habit of his when he was managing something internally. He needed the option of movement. "I have a lawyer coming tomorrow morning," he said. "Elena Voss. She's the best in the city for exactly this situation. She'll go through everything, your exposure, your options, how to position you as separate from my operations." "Am I separate from your operations?" He held her gaze. "You have always been completely separate from my operations." "Adrian, I need you to tell me the truth, not the version that protects me. The actual truth." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him decide something. "You have never been involved in anything I do. That is the truth. Your name on Ferrer's list is leverage. He knows you're the fastest way to get to me, and he knows I will. He stopped. He knows I care about your outcome, so he's making you a pressure point. He knows you care about my outcome, Vivian repeated slowly. Interesting. Adrian looked at the counter. You don't have to perform for me right now, she said, not unkindly, flatly. We're past that. Whatever we are, we're past that. So I need you to talk to me like a person and not like someone managing a situation. He looked up at her. I care about your outcome, he said, and his voice was different, stripped of the buffer. Just the words. I care about it more than I've been able to say. More than I know how to say without... He stopped again. Pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose briefly. A gesture she'd never seen from him, small and human and unguarded. I married you because you were the one person I met in 15 years of this life who had nothing to do with any of it. You walked into that room at Priya's gallery opening with paint on your left shoe and an argument already formed about a novel you were half finished with, and you looked at me like I was a regular person, and I had no idea what to do with that. Vivian said nothing. I kept you at a distance because, in my world, proximity to me kills people. His voice was even. Not dramatic, just factual, which made it worse. I told myself that was love. I told myself that keeping you uninvested, keeping you safe, keeping you at exactly the right arm's length was the... I told myself it was... He stopped. His jaw tightened. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you spent 2 years making a decision about my feelings without asking me what my feelings were. He absorbed that. Yes. It sounds like you decided what I could handle and constructed a marriage around that decision. Yes. And now I'm on page 3 of a federal informant's document, and I still don't have a vote. That's what tomorrow morning is for. His voice was quiet and steady, and she understood, looking at him, that this was the closest he had come to an apology in his adult life. Not the word itself, the architecture of it, the willingness to stand still inside it. I'm going to fix this. I'm going to get you clear. And then... He stopped. And then whatever you decide, It's your decision. I understand that now. Vivian held the mug and said nothing. Outside, Carroll Gardens was living its evening. Distant car sounds, a dog somewhere, the indifferent beauty of a Brooklyn block that had no idea what was happening inside this particular brownstone. She thought about how ordinary it all sounded. She thought about how ordinary she had wanted her life to be, once, before she understood that ordinary was a thing you had to fight for and not a thing that simply arrived. I'm going to sleep, she said. I'm not going back to anything tonight. I'm just going to sleep. He nodded. The room at the top of the stairs. She stood up. She moved past him toward the doorway, and she stopped, and without turning around, she said, For what it's worth. The gala. What you said to Ferrer. She paused. I believe you that it came from something. I don't know if it came from what you think it came from, but I believe there was something underneath it. She didn't wait for him to answer. She went up the stairs, and she found the room, and she lay down on a bed in a house that belonged to no one, and closed her eyes and slept the deep, crashed sleep of someone who has been running for a very long time and has finally stopped. She woke at 4 a.m. to the sound of the front door. Not a knock. The door itself, the specific sound of a lock that had been opened from outside quietly by someone who knew the mechanism. Vivian was upright before she was fully conscious. 2 years of living adjacent to Adrian's world had calibrated something in her nervous system that she hadn't asked for and couldn't turn off. She sat in the dark bedroom with her heart loud in her ears and her feet on the floor, and she listened. Voices below. Adrian's. One other. Male, she thought. Urgent and low. She moved to the top of the stairs. Can't wait until morning, they moved the timeline. The other voice. Someone she didn't recognize. Ferrer's meeting with the task force at 6 a.m. Whatever they're giving him, they're locking it in before the week is out. How did they move it? Adrian? Flat. Controlled. My source said end of month. Your source is burned. Ferrer found out and he moved everything up. Adrian, they have the Harmon files. The actual files, not copies, originals, which means someone inside gave them access. Silence. Someone inside, Adrian said. That's what I'm telling you. Vivian stood at the top of the stairs with her hand on the wall and felt the floor doing the thing again. The thing where it proved less solid than assumed. But this time it was different, because this time she knew enough to understand what she was hearing. And what she was hearing was that somewhere in the architecture of Adrian's world, something had already broken before they knew it was breaking. "Who knew about Harmon?" Adrian said. The other voice paused. "That's the part you're not going to like." "Tell me." Another pause. "Marcus." The silence that followed was absolute. Vivian had been in rooms with Adrian when he received bad news before. She had seen the controlled absorption of it, the smooth, professional recalibration. She had never heard silence from him like this. This was a different quality. This was the silence of a man whose architecture has just had a foundational piece removed. "You're sure," Adrian said. "The access logs don't lie. His credentials, his timing, 3 weeks ago, which lines up with when Ferrer's team suddenly got very specific about documentation they shouldn't have known existed." Marcus Reyes, the closest thing Adrian had to a friend. The man who had sat across from him last night with scotch and something that had looked from outside exactly like concern. Vivian's hand pressed flat against the wall. She thought about the hotel, the conversation, the way Marcus had driven over at 2 a.m, asked all the right questions, looked at Adrian with all the right expressions. She thought about the safe house. "Marcus knows it," Adrian had said. "It's clean." She went cold. She moved back from the stairs without breathing and went to the bedroom and found her phone on the nightstand and opened the map and looked at the address of this brownstone and thought, "Marcus knows this address. Marcus set this place up. And if Marcus gave Ferrer the Harmon files, then Marcus knows where we are, right now." She went to the bedroom door and opened it and said, from the top of the stairs, with a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to, "Adrian." Both men looked up. "We need to leave," she said. "Right now. Marcus knows this address." The other man, young, dark-haired, with the look of someone who ran on adrenaline and bad coffee, stared at her. Adrian looked at her for 1 second with an expression she couldn't fully read, and then he looked at the other man, and something passed between them that took no words at all. "Get the car," Adrian said. They were in motion within 4 minutes. Vivian in the back seat with her bag, the same bag she had carried out of the penthouse, the one with the books and the journal and the things that were hers. And Adrian in the front with the young man, whose name was apparently Danny, and who drove like someone who had been trained for exactly this kind of 4 a.m. navigation and found it clarifying. Adrian was on the phone, then off it, then on it again. His voice was precise and fast, and she understood almost none of the specifics, but she understood the shape of it. This was triage. This was a man cutting away everything non-essential and operating on what remained. She looked out the window at Brooklyn moving past, dark and ordinary, streetlights and storefronts, and the occasional person walking alone with somewhere to be. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the specificity of the betrayal. Not a stranger, not an enemy, but the man who had poured himself scotch in Adrian's living room 12 hours ago and asked, "Is this complicated?" with what had seemed like the bluntness of genuine friendship. She thought, this is the world. This is the actual world that Adrian lives in. Not the charity galas and the penthouse and the performance. This, 4 a.m. in a moving car because the person closest to you decided the price was right. She thought, I was going to Boston. She almost laughed again. The laugh was still too full of other things. "Where are we going?" she said. Adrian looked over his shoulder at her. His face in the passing streetlights looked different than she had ever seen it. Not younger exactly, but stripped. The calculation was still running, she could see that, but underneath it something else was visible that she didn't have a name for, and that she suspected he didn't let people see often. Somewhere Marcus doesn't know about. Give me 20 minutes. And then what? And then we figure out the next piece. Adrian, she held his gaze, I need to know what the flash drive is. He turned fully around in the seat. Danny kept his eyes on the road with the focused discretion of someone paid to have excellent peripheral vision and no memory. Adrian looked at Vivian with an expression that ran through 3 different things in the space of a second. Calculation, assessment, and then something that settled into something that looked almost like relief, as if a question he'd been dreading had finally been asked, and the asking of it was easier than the anticipation. "What do you know about a flash drive?" he said. "Nothing. Yet." But I know you, and I know that a man who has been betrayed by his closest ally while being investigated by a federal task force has something somewhere that can burn everyone down, including himself, and I think it's time you told me what it is." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, Brooklyn gave way to the expressway, and Danny accelerated, and the city opened up around them in the dark. Enormous and indifferent and full of the business of people who didn't know that in a black car doing 80 on the BQE, the most dangerous man in New York was looking at his wife and trying to decide, for the first time in 30 years, whether to trust someone completely. "There's a drive," he said. "It has everything. Every name, every transaction, every arrangement going back 11 years. Ferrer, the politicians he owns, the federal contacts he's compromised. Everything." He paused. "If that drive gets to the right people, it doesn't just take down my operation. It takes down the entire network. Every layer, things that go places people in this city think are untouchable." "Where is it?" "With someone I trust." "You trusted Marcus." The words were not cruel. They were just true. And they landed the way true things land, without drama, without softening, directly in the place that was already bruised. Adrian looked at her. "The drive is in the penthouse," he said quietly. "In the study. Third shelf, behind the Carver collection. There's a false back." Vivian stared at him. "You're telling me this," she said slowly, "because you think something is about to happen, and you need someone outside your world to know where it is." He didn't answer, which was, she had learned, his version of yes. "Adrian," her voice was very careful now, "what do you think is going to happen?" He looked at her for one more long moment, and then he turned back to face the road ahead. And in the passing light, she could see his jaw and his hands resting on his knee, and the specific stillness of a man who has run every calculation available to him and has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't want to say out loud because saying it makes it real. "They're going to arrest me," he said. "Probably within 48 hours. Ferrer's deal makes me the centerpiece, and when the task force moves, they'll want the arrest to be visible. An example." The car was very quiet. "And when that happens," he said, "I need to know that drive is safe. I need to know that He stopped, started again. "Someone I trust knows where it is and what to do with it." Vivian looked at the back of his head. She looked at her hands in her lap. She looked at the city through the window. The bridges, the lights, the water, the impossible, complicated, enormous fact of New York at 4:30 in the morning. She thought about Boston. She thought about Halcyon Press and the small apartment she hadn't found yet, and the quiet mornings with manuscripts and the long, slow, patient work of becoming herself again. She thought, that was a different version of this story. She thought, I don't think I'm in that version anymore. And somewhere behind them, in an office in Lower Manhattan where the lights had been on all night, a man named Dominic Ferrer was signing his name to a document that would, within 48 hours, begin the dismantling of everything. And on page 3 of the attached exhibit, in clean federal typescript, was a name that had never asked to be there and had done nothing to deserve it. And that name was Vivian Ashcroft DeLuca. And the people reading it were already deciding what use they could make of her. They drove for 31 minutes. Vivian counted them. She did not know why she counted them, except that her mind needed something to do that wasn't thinking about page 3 of a federal exhibit, or the name Dominic Ferrer, or the flash drive sitting behind the Carver collection on the third shelf of a study she had walked past 1,000 times without knowing what it contained. Counting minutes was concrete. Counting minutes kept the rest of it from arriving all at once. Danny pulled the car into the underground garage of a building in Sunset Park that had no identifying signage and a security camera above the entrance that Adrian acknowledged with a look but didn't comment on. He got out first. He scanned the garage with the automated efficiency of someone for whom checking a space before entering it had long ago stopped being a conscious decision and become simply the way his body moved through the world. Then he opened her door. She got out. She stood in the concrete cold of the garage with her bag on her shoulder and looked at him across the roof of the car and said, "How long have you known about Marcus?" He met her eyes. 20 minutes longer than you. And before that? Before that, I trusted him. He said it without defensiveness, just the bare statement of it. I trusted him for 11 years and I was wrong, and that is the entire story. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it because there was nothing else to say that would make it smaller, and she had learned, in 2 years adjacent to his world, that some things you simply had to carry at full weight. They went inside. The apartment on the 4th floor was not a safe house in the way the Carroll Gardens brownstone had been a safe house. It was something more personal than that. Smaller, with books on actual shelves and a kitchen that looked used, and a window that faced east toward the water. Vivian noticed all of this because she noticed everything now, cataloged everything. Her nervous system still running at the high alert frequency it had found somewhere around 4 a.m. and had not been able to downshift from. Danny stationed himself near the door. Adrian made 2 more calls in the kitchen, voice low and rapid, and Vivian sat on the couch and opened her bag and took out the green journal and held it without opening it, just held it, because it was the most genuinely hers thing she had on her, and she needed to feel the weight of something that belonged only to herself. Adrian came back and sat down. Actually sat, across from her, which she registered as significant, because he had spent the last several hours in constant motion, and stillness from him now meant something had been decided. Elena Voss can't come to us, he said. She's been contacted by the task force directly, which means they're moving faster than 48 hours. He looked at his hands for a moment. We have maybe until morning. Morning, Vivian repeated. It's already morning. Until business hours. Until the kind of morning where federal agents knock on doors in front of neighbors. She looked at him. What do you need from me? He met her eyes. I need you to go to the penthouse. The apartment was very quiet. You need me to go get the drive, she said. I can't go. If I'm being watched, and I have to assume I'm being watched, I walk into that building and I'm handing them a reason to move now instead of at 8 a.m. But he paused. You have every right to be there. You live there, legally. You left clothes there. You left things. There is nothing unusual about Vivian DeLuca going home. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about everything she had wanted 3 days ago, which was to disappear quietly and let this entire life become something she used to have. She thought about Boston and the publishing house, and the mornings with manuscripts. She thought about how linear that plan had seemed and how completely the linearity of it had dissolved. If I go in there, she said, and they're watching the building, you're the wife going home. That's all. And if there are people inside who are not federal agents. His jaw tightened. My people are in the building, lobby and 38th floor. You won't be alone. Your people, she said, like Marcus was your people. He absorbed that. I know, I understand why you're saying that. These are people Marcus never had access to. I kept certain things compartmentalized even from him. I understand now why that matters. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time in the years she had known him, he looked his age and then some. Vivian, I'm not going to tell you this isn't dangerous. I'm asking you to decide for yourself whether you'll do it. She looked at him. She looked at the green journal in her hands. She thought about the woman she had been 3 months ago, quietly packing a suitcase behind winter coats, assembling her escape in increments so small they were almost invisible. She thought about how that woman had believed that the most important thing was to remove herself from this world cleanly and completely. She thought, that woman wasn't wrong. She just didn't know what she was going to find out before she could leave. Third shelf, she said, behind the Carver collection. False back. Yes. What does the drive look like? Black, the size of my thumbnail. There's a piece of red tape on one end. She nodded. She stood up. She put the journal back in her bag. She looked at Danny by the door, then back at Adrian. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you'll be back. Adrian! Her voice was flat and specific. If I'm not back in 2 hours, you don't wait. You take whatever you have and you move. Do you understand me? He looked at her. Do you understand me? She said again. Yes, he said, and his voice was rough at the edges in a way she had never heard from him. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on it and didn't turn around. When this is over, she said quietly, I still need you to answer the question I asked you at the penthouse. The real answer. Not the version that protects me or protects yourself. The actual answer. She opened the door and walked out before he could respond, because she needed to be moving and she needed to not look at his face right now, and she had a drive to find in approximately 2 hours to do it in. The cab ride to the penthouse took 22 minutes. She spent them looking out the window and running through the movements in her mind. lobby, elevator, study, third shelf, false back, elevator, lobby, out. She ran it on repeat, clean and sequential, because if she kept the movements in the front of her mind, there was less room for the other things. The tightness in her chest, the way her hands felt slightly wrong, the knowledge that somewhere in this city, a man named Dominic Ferrer had signed his name to something that had hers on it. She paid the cab. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the building and looked up at it. 43 floors of glass and steel, and the particular kind of money that doesn't need to announce itself. And she breathed. In, out. The doorman opened the door. He knew her face. He nodded. She nodded back. The lobby was as it always was. Marble floor, security desk. Two men she recognized, building staff, or presented as building staff, who watched her cross to the elevator with expressions calibrated to precisely nothing. She got in the elevator. She pressed 43. She watched the numbers rise. On the 38th floor, the doors opened briefly. She had not pressed 38, and a man she had never seen before got on. He was in a building maintenance uniform, and he was carrying nothing, and he did not look at her, and she had to decide in the space of approximately 1 second whether this was one of Adrian's people or something else entirely. He reached past her and pressed the lobby button. She watched his hands. No weapon visible. Body relaxed, weight balanced, not the coiled readiness of someone about to do something. She breathed. The doors opened at 43. She got off. He stayed on. She walked down the hallway to the penthouse door. She had her key. She had always had her key, even now, even after everything. She unlocked the door and pushed it open and stepped inside and stood in the entrance hall of the home she had lived in for 2 years and felt the specific weight of what a place becomes when you've decided to leave it. Objects become artifacts. Rooms become evidence. Everything looked like a photograph of itself. She did not stop to feel any of it. She moved. Study was down the hall, past the living room. She had been in it dozens of times. Adrian worked there when he worked at home, and she had brought coffee and collected forgotten reading glasses and knocked on the door for enough small domestic reasons that she knew the room by feel. Third shelf. She scanned the spines. Carver. She found it. 3 novels and a collection, Raymond Carver, organized with the books he owned that he had actually read, which were filed separately from the display books, and distinguishable if you knew what to look for. She moved them, found the false back immediately, not because she had known to look, but because once your hands are expecting a seam, they find it. A small panel. She pressed the left side and it released on a hinge, and there, in a small recessed space behind it, was a black USB drive the size of a thumbnail with a piece of red tape on one end. Her fingers closed around it. She stood there for just a moment with the drive in her palm, and she thought, this is what 11 years of a man's life compresses to. The size of a thumbnail. A piece of red tape. She put it in the inside pocket of her bag against the spine of the green journal. She turned to leave. The study door was open. She had left it open. But the light in the hallway was different. She noticed this in the animal, pre-verbal part of her brain before she noticed it consciously. The way you notice a change in air pressure before you notice the smell that caused it. Someone was in the apartment. She stood absolutely still. 2 seconds. 3. A voice from the living room. Mrs. DeLuca. Not a question. She was expected. She walked out of the study and into the hallway and into the living room and found Marcus Reyes standing in the center of the room she had performed 2 years of her marriage in, with his jacket open and his hands visible and an expression on his face that she could not quite read. Not triumphant, not cold, something more complicated and more exhausted than either. Behind him, near the window, was a man she didn't know. Larger, still. "Where is he?" Marcus said. She held his gaze. Her heart was extremely loud. She could feel it in her ears, in her throat, in the specific way her hands wanted to close into fists, which she did not allow. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Vivian." He said her name with something that was almost gentleness. "I've known Adrian for 11 years. I know every property, every contact, every contingency. There are 2 places he goes when everything falls apart, and you're standing in one of them, which means he's in the other." He paused. "I don't want to hurt anyone. That's not what this is." "What is it then?" "It's a transaction. It's always been a transaction." He looked at her with an expression she identified, after a moment, as genuine regret. which was somehow the most frightening thing in the room. I have people who want the drive. Adrian has the drive. I need him to understand that cooperating is the only version of this where everyone walks away intact. And if I don't know where he is, then I'm going to have to encourage you to remember. He said it simply, without inflection, the way you say something you have accepted as a fact but do not enjoy. I don't want to do that. I want you to know that. She looked at him. She thought about the drive in the inside pocket of her bag against the spine of the green journal. She thought about the weight of it, the specific small weight of it, and what it meant that it was there and not on the shelf. She thought, he doesn't know I already have it. She thought, this is the only advantage I have, and it will last approximately as long as it takes him to look at the shelf in the study. She said, Marcus, can I ask you something? He waited. Was any of it real? The friendship? Was there any part of it that wasn't the transaction? Something moved across his face. She watched it happen. The genuine thing surfacing briefly before the professional thing covered it again. Some of it, he said, and his voice was different for exactly one sentence. The early years, some of it was real. Does that matter to you? Less than it should. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. Tell me where he is. I'm not going to do that. Vivian, I'm not going to do that, she said again, and her voice was clear and steady, and she was distantly amazed by this, by the quality of her own stillness, by the discovery that somewhere inside the woman who had stood behind a marble column at a charity gala 3 weeks ago and decided to pack a suitcase, there was something with a spine made of something considerably harder than she had known. If you want to hurt me to find him, that's your decision, but I'm not going to help you. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The large man near the window shifted his weight. And then the front door of the penthouse came open with a sound like the difference between a lock being turned and a lock being bypassed. And 3 things happened in approximately 2 seconds. Marcus turned toward the door, the large man near the window reached for something inside his jacket, and Vivian dropped to the floor behind the couch with her bag against her chest, because her body made the decision before her mind did. And her body, it turned out, had better instincts than she had given it credit for. Shouts, movement, the specific sounds of large men in a confined space. She pressed her back against the base of the couch. She heard Marcus's voice, sharp, commanding. She heard another voice she didn't recognize. She heard something strike the coffee table above her and felt the impact travel through the floor, and she kept her hand pressed flat against the outside of her bag, against the place where the drive was, because that was the one thing she could control, and she controlled it with everything she had. Then silence. Then Adrian's voice, somewhere above her, breathing hard. Vivian. She stood up from behind the couch. The living room looked like an argument that had been physical. The coffee table was displaced. A lamp was on the floor. Marcus was against the far wall with Danny's arm across his chest, and an expression of pure fury that had collapsed into something more complicated. Something that looked, around the edges, like a man who had run a calculation and arrived at the wrong answer. The large man near the window was on the floor, zip-tied at the wrists, which told her that the man she'd seen in the elevator in the maintenance uniform had not been random at all. Adrian was standing 4 feet from her with a cut above his right eyebrow that was bleeding into his eye and his jacket half torn at the shoulder, and he was looking at her with an intensity that had no name she knew. You have it, he said. Not a question. She reached into her bag and held up the drive. He looked at it. He looked at her. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyebrow briefly, looked at the blood, and then looked back at her with the expression of a man who has just watched someone do something he hadn't believed they were capable of and is still processing the recalibration that requires. You went in there knowing he might be here, he said. I went in there to get the drive. Vivian, don't. She lowered her hand. The drive was in her fist. Don't tell me it was reckless. Don't tell me you didn't think I could handle it. I'm so tired of people deciding what I can handle. He looked at her. His jaw was tight. The blood was still tracking slowly down his temple. I was going to say thank you, he said. She looked at him. Across the room, Marcus said with the flat bitterness of a man who has nothing left to manage. It's over, Adrian, you understand that. Whatever you do with that drive, whatever move you make, the task force has enough without Ferrer. It's over. Adrian looked at him. He looked at his oldest friend, or the man who had occupied that role for 11 years, which was not the same thing. which he was understanding now was not the same thing at all. And whatever he felt about it, he kept it in the place where he kept things that cost him, which was somewhere nobody was ever invited to go. "Get him out of here," he said to Danny. Danny moved. Marcus let himself be moved. At the doorway, he stopped and looked back, not at Adrian, but at Vivian. He looked at her for just a moment with the expression of someone who has something to say and has accepted that they've lost the right to say it. Then he was gone. The penthouse was quiet. Vivian became aware in stages that her hands were shaking, not violently, the small, precise shaking of someone whose body has been running on adrenaline and is now beginning to present the bill. She looked at her hands and noted this about them with the detached clarity of someone observing a natural phenomenon. Adrian crossed the room. He stood in front of her and put his hands on her arms, not grabbing, just the weight of his hands on her arms, and looked at her face with something she still didn't have the vocabulary for, something that was too unguarded and too large for the word she kept reaching toward. "You're okay," he said. "I know," she said. "I know I am." He looked at the drive in her hand. He looked at her face. The cut above his eye was still bleeding, and she reached up, automatically, and pressed her thumb against it. Just the pressure of it, stopping the flow the way you do when you know basic things about the body. And he went very still under the touch, still in the specific way of someone receiving something they had convinced themselves they didn't need. "We have to move," she said. Her voice was steady. She kept her thumb against the cut. "We have about 2 hours before the kind of morning you described." "I know. If you're going to be arrested, I know. Then I need to know what you want me to do with this." She held the drive up between them. "Specifically, who gets it, how, what the plan is." He looked at it, he looked at her, and then he told her everything. The name of the federal prosecutor who was not Ferrer's, the specific evidence hierarchy on the drive and what order it needed to be presented in. The 2 journalists, one at the Times, one independent, who had been building adjacent cases and would understand what they were looking at. He talked for 11 minutes straight, the most words she had heard from him at one time in 2 years of marriage, and she listened with the focused attention of someone who understands that they are being trusted with the full weight of something and intends to hold it. When he finished, she nodded. She lowered her hand from his face. There was blood on her thumb. She looked at it for a moment. "I have one more question," she said. He waited. "At the gala, when Ferrer asked about me and you said—" She stopped. "I know what you told me it meant. I know what you said in the brownstone about distance and protection. I need to know if that's the complete truth or if it's the version of the truth that makes you the most bearable to yourself." He was very still. "Because I can work with the complete truth," she said. "I cannot work with the managed version. Not anymore. We are standing in our living room at 5 in the morning with your blood on my hand and a federal arrest incoming and 11 years of someone else's secrets in my bag. And I need you to be a real person right now, not a calculation, a person." Adrian DeLuca, who had spent 30 years making silence into armor, looked at his wife with the expression of a man who has run out of the armor and is discovering what is underneath it, which turns out not to be nothing, which turns out, in fact, to be the one thing that makes the armor's necessity the most catastrophic. He opened his mouth, and from downstairs, from the lobby 43 floors below, Danny's voice came through on Adrian's phone with the 2 words that meant everything was already happening and none of the things they hadn't said yet were going to be said here, in this room, tonight. "They're here. They're here." 2 words. Danny's voice through the phone, flat and stripped of everything except the fact itself. Adrian looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Adrian. Between them, suspended in the 5 in the morning silence of a penthouse apartment that smelled like old flowers from a vase nobody had changed, was the entirety of everything they hadn't said yet. The question she had asked, the answer he had opened his mouth to give, the blood on her thumb, all of it hanging in the air like a sentence interrupted mid-breath. He took the phone. "How many?" 8 vests, federal, 2 vehicles front, 1 in the garage. They're not rushing. They want it clean. "Is there a lawyer present?" "Not yet." Adrian looked at Vivian again. His jaw was tight. The cut above his eye had slowed but not stopped, and there was a thin track of dried blood down the side of his face that made him look both more dangerous and more human than she had ever seen him simultaneously. He made a decision. She could see it happen, the specific internal movement of it, faster than words. "Let them in," he said into the phone. "Tell them I'm coming down." Danny's silence lasted exactly 1 second. "You sure?" "Tell them I'm coming down voluntarily, no resistance. I want that on record." He hung up. He looked at the drive in Vivian's hand. She was still holding it, had been holding it through all of it, her fingers closed around the small black rectangle with the red tape like it was the one fixed point in a room that had been tilting. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet and removed a card, plain white, a name and a number, no title, and held it out to her. "Nora Reeves," he said. "She's not my lawyer. She's an investigative journalist. She's been working the Farah story from the outside for 14 months. When you call her, tell her you have the Harmon files and the subsidiary documentation and the political correspondence from 2019. She'll know what that means." Vivian took the card. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You've been planning to give this to someone." "I've been planning to give it to the right someone." He held her gaze. "I wasn't sure who that was until about 40 minutes ago." She put the card in her bag, next to the drive, next to the green journal. "Adrian." Her voice was careful, level. The voice she had used at the gala when she picked up her champagne glass and decided to survive the evening. "What happens to you now?" "I cooperate," he said. "Fully. Everything I know about Farah's operation, his federal contacts, the money trail. I've been holding it as leverage. Now I use it as the price of something different." He paused. "I'll be in custody for a while. Maybe a long while. That depends on things I don't fully control." "And your organization?" "It ends." He said it without hesitation, which was the most surprising thing she had heard from him in 2 years. Not a flinch, not a negotiation, just the 2 words, clean and final. It ends. The people who can walk away clean, walk away. The rest is for prosecutors to sort out. She looked at him. "You decided this already," she said. "Before tonight, before Marcus, before the arrest. You had already decided." He met her eyes. "I decided it in a hotel room in Carroll Gardens when you told me we were out of time, and I realized I had been afraid of the wrong things for a very long time." The elevator at the end of the hallway chimed softly. Building sounds. Normal building sounds, except that in the lobby, 43 floors below, 8 federal agents were waiting for a man who was about to walk to them voluntarily, which was the one move nobody in their world would have predicted, and which was, Vivian understood, the first genuinely free decision Adrian DeLuca had made in 30 years. He straightened his jacket. He looked at himself briefly in the dark reflection of the window. The city behind his own image, enormous and indifferent as always. And then he looked at her. "The question you asked me," he said. She waited. "At the gala. What I said to Ferrer." He stopped, started again. Not the managed version. She could see him choosing, actively choosing, to not manage it. "I married you because you were the only person I had met in my adult life who looked at me like I was someone who could be different than what I was. Not reformed, not fixed. Just different. Like the other version of me was still possible." He paused. "I didn't know how to live inside that, so I kept you at the distance where I could still see it without having to try." "Mochardin," she said nothing for a moment. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "I know. It's also one of the loneliest things I've ever heard." He nodded, just the one nod. "Yes." She looked at him standing in their living room, the living room of the life they had performed together for 2 years, with blood on his face and his jacket torn, and the city behind him and the arrest waiting 43 floors below, and she felt something she didn't have a single clean word for. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not in any shape she could hand him right now. It was not love in the uncomplicated sense, because nothing between them had ever been uncomplicated, and she did not think pretending otherwise would help either of them. It was something more like recognition, the specific feeling of finally seeing the actual shape of something you have been looking at in bad lighting for a very long time. "Go," she said quietly. "Don't make them come up." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he picked up his phone and his jacket, and he walked down the hallway toward the elevator, and she watched him go, and she did not call him back, and she did not look away. The elevator doors opened. He stepped in. He turned and looked at her across the length of the hallway. And for just a moment, 1 second, maybe less. His face was completely unguarded in the way she had spent 2 years trying to locate and had only found in fragments until tonight. Then the doors closed. She stood in the living room alone. She stood there for a while. The apartment ticked and breathed around her the way expensive apartments do in the early morning, the heat system cycling, the refrigerator in the kitchen making its small, consistent sound. She looked at the lamp on the floor from earlier. She looked at the displaced coffee table. She looked at the window and the city going gray at the edges with the specific gray of a dawn that doesn't care what happened the night before. Then she picked up her bag and she left. She called Nora Reeves from a diner on Atlantic Avenue at 6:15 in the morning. The diner was the kind of place that had been exactly itself for 40 years. Linoleum countertops, coffee that arrived without being asked for, a cook visible through the pass-through window who acknowledged nothing and noticed everything. Vivian sat in a booth at the back with both hands around a white ceramic mug and the drive on the table in front of her, and she called the number on the card, and a woman answered on the second ring, which meant Nora Reeves was either an insomniac or had been waiting for something. She sounded like someone who had been waiting for something. Vivian told her she had the Harmon files and the subsidiary documentation and the political correspondence from 2019. There was a silence on the line that lasted just long enough to be significant. Then Nora Reeves said, in a voice that was controlled and alert and barely containing something that sounded like 14 months of work arriving at its destination, "Where are you?" They met an hour later. Nora was in her mid-40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific tiredness of someone who had been carrying a story for a long time and was about to put it down. She sat across from Vivian in the booth, and she looked at the drive and she looked at Vivian, and she asked 3 precise questions, which Vivian answered precisely. And then Nora put the drive in her coat pocket and folded her hands on the table and said, "I need you to understand what this sets in motion. Tell me. This isn't just Ferrer. The political correspondence alone implicates 2 sitting senators and a deputy commissioner. When this publishes, and it will publish, I have the editorial backing and the legal support. The people on this drive will want to know where it came from." She paused. "They'll want to know who you are." "They already know who I am," Vivian said. "I'm on page 3 of Ferrer's exhibit." Nora looked at her for a moment. "You knew about that. I found out 2 days ago. And you still—" Nora stopped. She looked at the drive in her pocket, then back at Vivian. "Your lawyer needs to know about this transfer before I file anything. Simultaneously, not sequentially. You need to be positioned as a cooperating source, not a suspect." "Elena Voss," Vivian said. "Can you work with her?" "I've worked with Elena before." Something moved briefly across Nora's face, the trace of a history Vivian didn't need the details of. "I'll call her this morning." Vivian nodded. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the diner window at Atlantic Avenue, waking up. A produce truck double-parked, a woman with a stroller navigating the sidewalk, 2 men in construction vests arguing pleasantly about something at the corner, the morning going about its business, the city requiring nothing from her. "Can I ask you something?" Nora said. Vivian looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Not the legal strategy, the actual reason." Vivian thought about it. She thought about a marble column at a charity gala, a suitcase behind winter coats, a hotel room, and a woman named Celeste who had sat across from her with the expression of someone who had already paid the bill for a version of this same story. She thought about a drive the size of a thumbnail and what it meant that 11 years compressed to that. She thought about a man stepping into an elevator with his face finally unguarded and the doors closing between them. "Because the only way out of this life," she said slowly, "was to go through it. And going through it meant making sure the thing that destroyed it actually destroyed it. All of it, not just the part that touched me." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has spent 14 months believing in a story and has just found the person who was always supposed to be at the center of it. The arrest of Adrian DeLuca made the news at 7:42 a.m. Vivian saw it on her phone in the diner after Nora had left and she was on her second coffee, and the cook through the pass-through window had shifted into the breakfast rush with the focused efficiency of someone who found noise clarifying. The coverage was what she expected. The photograph taken outside the building, Adrian in the gray morning light in his torn jacket, surrounded by federal agents, his face composed into the precise, neutral expression of a man who has decided exactly how he wants to be seen in this moment. He was not handcuffed in the photograph. He had walked out voluntarily, and they had processed him with the procedural respect reserved for someone who is cooperating and is worth more cooperative than resistant. She looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at his face, the composed expression, and just at the edge of the frame, barely visible, the dried line of blood above his eyebrow from the cut she had pressed her thumb against in the living room of their apartment. She put her phone face down on the table. She sat in the diner for a while longer. She ordered toast. She ate it methodically, because she had not eaten since the night before and her body was presenting its own separate bill, distinct from the emotional one, which required payment regardless of everything else. Then she paid for the coffee and the toast, and she went outside into the morning, and she stood on Atlantic Avenue with her bag on her shoulder, and she breathed the cold air, and she made a list. Not the list she had made at the gala, not the list of escape and disappearance, a different list. The kind you make when you're not running away from something but toward something, which feels different in the body, she was discovering. Heavier and lighter simultaneously. Lawyer. Elena Voss this morning. Her own exposure, her own positioning, her name on page 3 handled the way it deserved to be handled, not as Adrian DeLuca's liability, but as Vivian Ashcroft's legal circumstance, addressed by her own representation on her own terms. Then Boston. She was not abandoning Boston. She was delaying it, which was not the same thing. The Halcyon Press position had a start date that could be negotiated. Priya had told her this quietly, back when Boston was still theoretical. It was negotiable. It would wait. And in between, the work. The long, unglamorous, non-cinematic work of becoming someone whose life was genuinely her own, which she understood now was not going to happen in one dramatic exit through a lobby. It was going to happen the way the suitcase had been packed, slowly, in increments, piece by piece, until one day you looked at the shape of your own life and it finally resembled you. She walked east toward the water because she needed to walk, and she needed to see something large and indifferent, and the harbor was both of those things. The months that followed were not linear, which she should have expected and did not. Elena Voss was exactly what her reputation had promised: precise, unsentimental, and ferociously competent. She had Vivian's name removed from the primary exhibit within 3 weeks, and her status converted to witness rather than subject within 6. It cost nothing except hours of testimony delivered in a conference room that smelled like recycled air and other people's anxiety, and Vivian gave those hours with the same methodical patience she had brought to packing the suitcase. Nora Reeves published the first piece in late November. It ran 12,000 words and cited documents, correspondence, and a source identified only as a former associate of the DeLuca organization. The deputy commissioner resigned within 48 hours. The senators hired lawyers within the hour. Furr's immunity deal collapsed when the documentation on the drive revealed that he had been providing falsified records to the task force, that the evidence he'd offered about Adrian's operation had been curated to protect himself and implicate others selectively. The task force, confronted with the actual Harmon files, had to rebuild their case from a foundation they hadn't known was compromised. It was not a clean story. It never resolved into a narrative where one person was the villain and justice arrived in a satisfying shape. The city's corruption turned out to be less a pyramid with one person at the top and more a web where every strand connected to every other strand, and pulling on any of them moved all of them. Some people went to trial, some negotiated, some walked away with less than they deserved to lose. Adrian cooperated fully and completely, and his cooperation was, by the assessment of the federal prosecutor who was not Ferrer's, the most comprehensive dismantling of an organized network she had seen in 20 years of this work. His sentence reflected this. It was not nothing. It was not supposed to be nothing, and Vivian had not asked for it to be nothing, because she understood that the cost of what he had built was real, and that real costs required real payment. But it was finite. It had an end, and he served it without complaint, which his lawyer mentioned to her once, and she had nodded and said she was not surprised. She went to see him twice in the first year. Both times were in a room with a table between them and a guard near the door, and the particular quality of institutional light that makes everyone look slightly diminished. The first visit was functional, legal matters, the final stages of the cooperation, documentation she needed him to sign. They talked like two people conducting careful, necessary business, which they were, and the conversation was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was honest, which was something. The second visit was different. She had cut her hair in October. Not dramatically. Not a statement cut. Not the kind of thing that announces itself. Just shorter, in the way of someone who had made a practical decision about the amount of maintenance they wanted their daily life to require. She sat across the table from him, and he looked at her for a moment before saying anything, and she saw, in the look, something that was simple and unguarded, and did not require translation. "Boston," he said. "January," she said. "I start in January." He nodded. "Priya's friend. The publishing house. Halcyon Press, junior editor. It's mostly acquisitions reading, but—" She stopped. "It's mine. The position is mine. I found the apartment last month. It's very small and it faces a parking structure, but it has good light in the morning." He was quiet for a moment. "Are you happy?" She looked at him. "Not yet," she said honestly. "But I'm becoming something. I think that's what happy is made of, the becoming." He held her gaze. "I think you're right." They sat with that for a moment. "I've been seeing a therapist," he said. "They have someone here. It's—" He paused, and the pause contained the precise difficulty of a man who has spent his entire adult life treating interior life as a liability, describing the act of being asked to treat it as something else. "It's hard. It's harder than anything I've done," which is a strange thing to say given he gestured slightly at the room around them. "It makes sense," she said. "She asked me what I'm afraid of." He looked at the table. "Not in a general way. The specific thing. I didn't answer her the first time. The second time I told her I was afraid of being genuinely known, that once someone saw the complete thing, not the controlled version, not the performance, they'd have everything they needed to leave." Vivian looked at him. She felt the weight of that land in the specific place in her chest where 2 years of a marriage had lived. "What did she say?" She said, "That's not a fear about being known. That's a fear about being loved." He met her eyes. She said, "Those aren't the same thing. I'm still working on the difference." Vivian was quiet for a long moment. "You are genuinely known to me," she said. "You have been for a while, longer than you realize." She paused. "I haven't left." Something moved through his face, not relief exactly, something larger than relief, and older and more tentative, as if he was receiving something he had long ago stopped allowing himself to expect. "No," he said. "You haven't." She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the institutional light and the table between them and the guard near the door, and all the distance that was still real and could not be wished away by honesty, however full and late arriving that honesty was. "I'm not coming back to what we were," she said. "I need you to know that with complete clarity. The marriage we had is gone. That version is gone." "I know." "If there's something else, something different, something built out of different materials, built honestly, that's a different conversation. That's a conversation for a different time, but I need to be Vivian first, just Vivian, for a while." "I know that too," he said, and his voice was steady and without plea, which was its own form of progress, and she recognized it. She stood up, she picked up her coat, she looked at him one more time. This man who had been the most complicated presence of her adult life, who had married her for reasons that were and were not what she had believed, who had kept her at arm's length out of a fear he had mistaken for protection, who was sitting in a room that smelled like institutional cleaning products, trying, genuinely and belatedly, to become something different than what he had built himself to be. She thought, that is real. Whatever else it is or isn't, that is real. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he said, and then quietly, with the specific care of a man who has learned to say true things instead of tactical ones. "Vivian, the version of me that could have been different, you're the only person who ever saw it. I want you to know that I know what that cost you, and I'm sorry." She stood with her coat over her arm and looked at him. "I know you are," she said. She left. She walked down the corridor and through the processing area and out through the doors into the cold air of a February afternoon in New York, and she stood on the pavement with the sky flat and white overhead, and she breathed. In, out, the simple animal fact of it. She was not healed. She understood that clearly and without self-pity. 2 years of a particular kind of life left marks that did not resolve in months, and she was not going to pretend otherwise or perform a recovery she hadn't finished. But she was intact. She was Vivian Ashcroft, in her own name, in her own coat, with an apartment in Boston that had Good Morning Light and a publishing job that nobody had given her, and a green journal in her bag that she had been writing in again. Not about him, not about the marriage, but about herself, which was the hardest and most necessary subject she had ever attempted. She walked to the subway. She took it back to Manhattan. She had a lunch with Priya, who was coming down for the weekend and who had reserved a table at the kind of place where nobody knew their names and the food was unremarkable and the conversation could be anything. She was 15 minutes early, which meant she had 15 minutes on a bench in a small park near the restaurant, watching the city do what the city always did: move and move and move. Indifferent and enormous and full of people whose entire lives were happening simultaneously all around her, each one a complete world she would never know the interior of. She thought about a terrace, the Whitmore Hotel terrace, the night of the gala, which she had not actually stood on. She had been inside behind a marble column in a red dress she had later thrown away. She thought about what it would have felt like to step outside instead of overhearing something and understanding everything. She thought about the version of the story where she never heard the words, where she went on performing for another year, 2 years, indefinitely. The marriage that was a performance inside a life that was a performance. She thought, no. Even that version ended. Every version of that story ended at some point, because the truth has a patience that outlasts any performance. It always arrives eventually. The only variable is whether you're the one who surfaces it or whether it surfaces you. She had surfaced it. It had cost her almost everything she thought she had, and given her back everything she actually needed, and she was still separating the two piles into their correct categories, which was slow work and would probably continue for a long time. Priya arrived 7 minutes late with a scarf that had come half unwound and a story already starting before she reached the bench, the way Priya always arrived, fully in motion, fully herself, not performing any version of anything for anyone. Vivian stood up. She smiled. A real one. The kind that started somewhere internal and arrived at the face as a secondary event, not the other way around. "You cut your hair again," Priya said. "Little bit." "I like it." "I know, I do too." They walked toward the restaurant together, two women on a sidewalk in New York, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon that was ordinary in the specific way of an afternoon that comes after extraordinary things and has the particular quality of peace that only that sequence produces. Years later, in a small ceremony in a garden in Connecticut that had 12 people in it and no photographers, and a judge who had gone to school with Priya and owed her a favor, Vivian Ashcroft and Adrian DeLuca married for the second time. There were no political alliances at the table, no criminal obligations, no carefully selected gowns in arterial red chosen to project a particular message to a particular audience. There was a morning that started cold and turned warm by noon, and there was food that someone's aunt had made, and there was Priya crying in the second row in a way she would later describe as purely allergic, and there was a garden in Connecticut in October with the leaves at the exact peak of their color, and there was Adrian, in a jacket with no tie, standing in the garden with an expression on his face that she had seen exactly twice before, once in the hallway of a penthouse at 5 in the morning, once across a table in a room with institutional light, the expression of a man who has stopped managing his face and is simply in it, present, unguarded, afraid in a way he no longer believed was the same as weak. And there was Vivian, in a dress she had chosen herself, in the color she had always preferred, which was not red. She stood across from him in the garden and she looked at him, the actual him, the complete and imperfect and genuinely known him, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to arrive in this garden on this morning, every cost and every loss and every long, unglamorous, necessary increment of the becoming. And she thought, this is what real things cost, not the grand dramatic gesture, not the chase through an airport or the confession in the rain. This, years of actual work. Years of two people choosing, separately and then together, to become different than what fear had made them. The judge said the words. Adrian looked at her and said what he had to say, and his voice was steady because he had practiced. She knew he had practiced, because Adrian DeLuca did not leave important things to chance, which was a flaw she had made peace with and occasionally found endearing. And what he said was not elaborate and not performed. It was the kind of sentence that cost something to say, which was how she knew it was true. She said what she had to say. The 12 people in the garden were very quiet. October light came through the trees at the angle that makes everything look the way you want to remember it. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, just the flat of his palm, briefly, the weight of it. And she leaned into it slightly, not dramatically, just the small, natural lean of someone receiving something they had stopped being afraid to want. Later, much later, standing on the garden terrace as the afternoon turned toward evening, and the 12 people dispersed into the specific warmth of a gathering that has no agenda, she stood beside him and looked at the trees and the light and the unremarkable beauty of an ordinary October afternoon in Connecticut. "I used to think strength was not needing anything," he said. He was looking at the trees. His voice was quiet and not performing anything. "I know," she said. "I was wrong about almost everything." "Not everything," she said. "You were right that it was complicated." He looked at her. She looked back. Between them, in the space where 2 years of beautiful distance had lived, there was something different now. Not the absence of difficulty. She was not naive enough, not anymore, to believe that what they had built was immune to the weight of what they were. But underneath the difficulty, and through it, and on the other side of it, something that had been tested by everything available and had not dissolved. Something real. The only kind worth keeping. The light in the garden went gold and then amber, and then the long, slow purple of an October evening arriving, and the 12 people gathered for warmth, and someone opened a bottle of something, and Vivian Ashcroft stood in a garden in Connecticut in a dress the color she had always preferred, with her whole and imperfect life around her. And she was exactly, not almost, not performing, not in the process of becoming, but exactly, herself. That was the victory. Not the dismantling of an empire, not the exposure of corruption, not the arrest or the cooperation or the legal maneuvering or any of the dramatic architecture of the 2 years that had preceded this afternoon. Those were the cost of admission. The victory was this: a woman who knew her own name, standing in good light, choosing what was true. Everything else was just the story that got her here. End.